In this video, we'll be demonstrating how to hand sew a partial backstitch. You'll need needles, a needle threader, thread, and scissors. And of course, your backstitch template. This is the same template that we used to complete the full backstitch, so we'll modify our technique just a little to complete the partial backstitch. So I've been working hard on some examples of the partial backstitch using both a double strand and a single strand in my examples, and I've left my last one open so that we can work on that one together. So first, using a double strand, which that means my knot is tied at the end of both strands, I'm going to start my partial backstitch. And right on top of the work, I'm going to begin. So I'm going to enter in at my first dot, but I'm going to come up between the two. And I'm going to pull through. And I'm going to use this stitch to start my anchor. So at the same point that I started, I'm going to go in and come out at the same point. That's one. I'll do that 2 more times to secure my anchor stitch. Two. Have a little thread trapped in. There we go. And 3. Now I'm ready to start my partial back stitches. I'll go in and come up at our next dot, which is our second dot, and pull through. Now go back just half the distance and come back up through our next. I'll go back half the distance and come up through our next marking. So the half back stitch can be used for any seam. You can stitch any seam using this partial or half back stitch. It's known as both the partial back stitch and the half back stitch. It's most often used for understitching finished facings, and understitching is what prevents facings from rolling outside of a garment. So the partial backstitch, if you look carefully, it looks a lot like the running stitch, but it is in fact a backstitch, so it has the strength of a backstitch. And we're going to continue to work the stitch, going back half the distance from the previous stitch, creating that spacing that you see. So unlike the full, we're not going all the way back to the stitch that previous stitch that we made. We're just covering half the distance. And I'm going to continue working my partial back stitch all the way to the end of the row. So I've been working my partial back stitch, and I'm not quite to the end of the row, but I'm running low on thread. So what I'm going to do is create an anchor stitch right here where I am, and that's 3 back stitches right over each other. That's 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to go ahead and cut that, knowing that my anchor stitch is going to lock that in place. And what I'll do is start my partial back stitch with my next anchor, with another anchor, and I'll just keep going. Sometimes you run out of thread when you're sewing by hand or with a machine, and we just end our stitch and then start again. All right, so I'm going to continue my anchor. I think I'm on my 3rd one. And then I'll continue with my partial back stitch by coming to our next marking. And going back in half that distance to our next marking. Covering half the distance back. My thread is all right. And all the way to the end of the row. Now I'm ready to make my final anchor stitches. One, 2, and 3. So now that I'm at the end of the row, I have several things that I want to cut. Of course, I'm going to cut right here at the end where I finished my partial back stitch. And now where I made my tie-in, there's a knot here that I'm going to clip. Remember, the knot is not what's securing my stitch, it's the anchor. So I can clip that knot and be secure that my stitch is still going to hold. And the one that I created at the beginning, because I started on top of the work this time, it's a knot on top, and if I don't want to see it there, just clip it. And now we've completed our row of the partial back stitch. All right, so now I have worked 7 rows of my partial back stitch, and I'm going to work 3 more without using the markings. So even though I won't have my markings, I can help make a straight line for me to follow by just folding my muslin and pressing down on it. And now I have a straight line to follow as I'm working my partial back stitch without the markings. So this time I'm going to use a single strand, which means I'm only knotting my long end, and my shorter strand is, remember, only 3 to 4 inches shorter than my longer end. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and begin working my partial back stitch without the markings. and I'll be starting with my anchor stitch. Making 3 back stitches in a row. 1, 2, 3. Now I can begin my partial back stitch by going in, coming up, and just going back, not all the way to my anchor stitch, but just halfway. By only going halfway back, it's going to look like I'm making a running stitch, but we know we're really doing a back stitch here. So I'm going to continue on all the way to the end of the row with my partial back stitch. All right, so now I'm approaching the end of my final row, and I'm going to close out this stitch, creating my anchor stitch, where I'll go over my final back stitch 3 times. 1, 2, 3, and I will end by cutting this thread and also I'll cut the thread that I started with, that first initial knot. So I've completed 10 rows of my partial back stitch. From the front, it looks like a running stitch. And from the back, you can see that it is in fact a back stitch. When you're finished, you should have a final product that looks something like this.